Welsch is of the opinion that one and the same situation, in this case, man, can present itself completely differently from another point of view. But man, in itself, does not exist. There are only other points of view, that is, subjective opinions that each individual forms with their own judgment. This includes nonsense like believing in whatever, human nature. But when it comes to logical consistency, there is no other way of seeing things. Something is either not logical or logical. Regardless of this, a wide variety of premises and priorities are possible. But if one and the same object is assumed, in this case, man, then it does not matter at all what attributes this man in itself is endowed with. You are always dealing with an abstract ghost in whose existence someone wants to believe for whatever reasons. But no knowledge, insight or truth is involved here. If the identity of one and the same thing were possible, then objective knowledge could also be justified. Then modernity and rationalism and universal logic would also have their justification. Because self-identity as a basic logical law contains a serious contradiction. Any epistemology that is based on it is problematic. One and the same object would be the object in itself. If this reference is removed, then there are only different perspectives. Welch's argument only works on an objectivist basis if the different perspectives of man deal with the same object, but they do not because this same object is an invention. The light that Welch speaks of is the light of the self-identical of one and the same object. Without this, there would be no light and no criterion by which one could judge whether a point of view has any light at all. Welch takes sides for the many and against the only, but his starting position is an absolute one. He speaks of the many, in itself, as well as the only, in itself. It is precisely this unique, unmistakable individual, special thing that Lyotard and Adorno want to protect against logical preparation. It is precisely the consideration of individual circumstances and these alone that give meaning to the concept of truth, justice or humanity. What the individual understands by truth, love, God and the devil is something other than a totalitarian definition from an elitist or authoritarian center. Apart from the poor justification that a miserable order is still better than no order at all, the prevailing systems of thought are all fundamentally based on absolutism. Because in them the generality represents the benchmark and from there, so to speak, top down at the end of the ladder at some point the individual appears as a being cut from the ribs of the general. So to speak. A quote from Felix Dahn from his book, Reason in Law, from 1879 shows how deeply this dogma is anchored in jurisprudence. On page 18 it says, "The basic law of human thinking is the subsumption of the individual under the higher general. What is intolerable to man is an erroneous subsumption that violates this necessary subsumption. The injustice, the untrue, the ugly are contradictive to the concept, illogical. The freedom of the individual is often praised as effective in advertising. But it is as rare as a major lottery win or a career as a pop star. However, it is ideal as a motivation for adaptation. The order of the general public is an order of security. Or the feeling of security, which comes from the regularity and equality of things. The freedom of the individual is curtailed at the expense of practical reasons of bureaucratization and automation. An economic purpose determines what happens. The principle of universality is primarily an economic one in the sense of reducing expense. However, the economy is not primarily understood as an ethical enterprise. The efficiency of the system is in the foreground with an undefined public good as an alibi. When postmodernism takes sides against unity, in the name of multiplicity, and against identity, in the name of difference, then the cardinal error of modernity, the inadmissible generalization, is repeated. The principle of unity as well as that of identity can make sense in the right place, and it is no different with multiplicity and difference. If individual circumstances are taken into account and one's own judgment with which to classify the respective situation plays a role, it is also possible to unify, identify or differentiate in a rational manner. Every view of things in themselves, as a totalitarian attack, as terror, deserves rejection, and this also applies to the view of multiplicity and difference, or incommensurability. Welch makes the mistake of all positivists, realists and empiricists in that he takes facts and a factual structure as given without a thorough inquiry. The multiplicity is said to be more fundamental than the unity, but multiplicity, unity, difference or equality are value judgments, and not characteristics and attributes of things itself. Plurality is not an attribute of the world, as Welch thinks, and not an invention of people who just want to be left alone and be as they are. If plurality simply is, and not a functional abstraction, then the principle of an unquestioned higher authority remains valid, which is called objective reality. It is also quite bold when Welch declares his key experience of the equality of heterogeneous views as a criterion for whether a speaker is competent or not. Anyone who doesn't follow his twisted relativism has a clouded consciousness. This is very reminiscent of Karl Marx and his objectively false consciousness. The Wish is also the father of the idea when Welch thinks that today's public has become sensitive to the plural structure of reality and that future people will live in a polyperspective world that is incomprehensible but manageable and in which knowledge always remains provisional. All that is missing is the skeptical abstinence from judgment, which was required in ancient Greece, so that one poses as little danger as possible to those in power. For Welch, multiplicity or diversity is the basic structure of the world, but that is nonsense. He himself can structure, divide and classify anything for his own purposes as he wants. But there is no objective neutral structure or classification that is independent of subjective purposes. It doesn't matter whether you describe reality as homogeneous or heterogeneous, harmonious or dramatic, uniform or diversely structured, which is what postmodernists like to do because they are always dealing with a reality in itself. Such a structure can be accepted for pragmatic reasons, as long as it is not claimed that it actually exists, in itself. When Welch seamlessly trades unity for multiplicity, he is merely replacing one absolute principle for another. There is still a surreptitious generality at work that does not require acceptance, but rather is to be followed as, in itself. Another example based on the same logical fallacy can be found in Chris Lorenz in his Construction of the Past, from 1997, page 28. Two statements are compared. Once that of a Parisian maid who said, "Yesterday they murdered my king," and that of a Jacobin magistrate who said that yesterday the citizen Louis Capet was executed. Two different perspectives are presented, both of which refer to one and the same fact, which is said to be unquestionably true: killing of someone. The logical error made here is that a generally valid cognitive principle is inferred from a circumstance that can hardly be doubted, namely that a person is dead. With the generally accepted characteristics of a death as a generally accepted fact and truth, that too should apply to other so-called truths and facts. Louis Capet and Louis XVI but are not the same person, even if only one person is executed. In both cases it is not the same objectively true statement. The citizen was executed for the magistrate and the king for the maid. If there were a universal existence, a knowledge, in itself, then the citizen would not be logically incommensurable with the king. You can only be a citizen, or a king, but not both together. As soon as a convention or a subjective meaning is confused with objective facts or truths, someone assumes a generality that cannot be logically justified without contradictions. Apart from that, there is not even a neutral basis in determining a cause of death, considering the disputes surrounding organ donation, where some prefer brain death and others prefer cardiac death. Ultimately, the question can only be decided from an ethical perspective. It is not uncommon to have indigenous peoples to serve as an example of the same validity as an archaeological point of view whereby its history of civilizational development is then viewed as an ideology. In such a pluralism there is no logical distinction between reason and emotion, so that indigenous and scientific thinking are also logically on the same level. But that is not the case because we are dealing with incommensurable premises. However, indigenous peoples and scientists can be compared on a human level. In both cases you are dealing with people who have opinions. Why shouldn't they? As a person with any views, one person is as good as another, equal, if you will. Viewed in itself, one can speak of a plurality of a flip-flop image, because the same drawing can be seen as a landscape but also as a face, but both are not possible at the same time, and that is the difference. There is no such thing as the same drawing or just a drawing in itself. You either see a landscape or a face or something else. The dialectical conceptual artists have particularly excelled when it comes to the in-itselfication of events. Marx calls it the necessity to think the impossible, when he calls for the concept of development to be viewed as both positive and negative at the same time. Such dialectics are the beginning of the end of logical consistency and the ticket to cloud cuckoo land. The connection to the individual is lost when the concrete circumstances, such as the unique place at a unique time, dissolve into an observation in itself and turn into a speculation that may or may not be true. The future will bring it or not. And it is precisely in this sense that such objectivities, that is, the promise of universality, are about a suspended transcendent state that is neither fish nor flesh, that paralyzes, deactivates, de-individualizes people and thus becomes compliant material for the purposes of domination. Lyotard has repeatedly emphasized that there is no supreme authority capable of passing judgment on all existing language games. But that is exactly what happens when it is claimed that science is only one opinion system among many, of many possibilities to understand the world, so that science does not have a privileged understanding of the world. There is no distinction between a science as a value and a logical universality, but rather the logical universality is, so to speak, identified with science. The value of logic lies in the fact that it is possible to make certain judgments derived from certain premises and in relation to them. Only the setting of the starting point is arbitrary. People may disagree about whether a particular starting point is acceptable or not. But once a prerequisite is accepted, then certain rules come with it given which, if broken, also render the basic assumption invalid. The different points of view, world views, opinions are equal without a higher law, but within a language game that has rules. There are those who play the game better and those who play it worse, that is, the purpose, the benefit that is pursued, achieved very well or just so-so or not at all. If I take the logical inconsistency as a yardstick, then I can also compare and divide the different understandings of the world, for example, into those in which logical thinking no longer plays a role at all and those in which, in my opinion, there are still too many logical inconsistencies, and again those that are largely acceptable, so that the joint struggle for constructive criticism could be worthwhile. Such a comparison of the different views can also be carried out in the understanding of certain concepts. Mr. Welch takes e.g. Kant's view that reason only exists in the plural, e.g. a pure, a practical reason, etc. In the end there is an aesthetic and even religious reason, and one should not be surprised if in this direction one suddenly speaks of an emotional, or even a muscular intelligence. Welch secretly assumes that there is something like a higher spirit of reason in itself, something that pure logic and practical reason and so on have in common, so that practical or pure reason is, so to speak, an subsidiary of it. Skepticism's bad reputation also stems from the same error of believing that there is such a thing as objective knowledge. Only the reference to a fictitious objectivity turns skepticism into a skepticism that makes no sense at all without this objectivity. Nothing speaks against showing an aesthetic or a religious or practical interest, without the term reason being involved. The unification of these interests or purposes under a common concept such as reason is precisely a move toward the whole, toward the unity that Lyotard so readily rejects. So it means little if one celebrates postmodernism as a state in which the most diverse teachings, directions and truths are equally accepted and, so to speak, faith and atheism, emotional anarchy and all kinds of opinions coexist, as Paul Valery says. Such pluralism is nothing but a wild bunch as a result of the abolition of absolutism. Nothing is really gained from this. Because without an ethically legitimate order, only the natural forces will ultimately determine what happens. Equipped with sophistic rhetoric that conjures up a deceptively real unity out of the sentimentality of simple people.